FME Server, it is automation. You can automate practically anything with it, but it's more than that even. It's the ability to create web services. You can either create brand new web services or you can implement existing standards. And so why do we care about this? Well, mobile devices need data. They need to be able to connect. What do they connect to? They connect to web services. But also desktop applications more and more are taking advantage of the cloud, accessing file systems and things on the cloud. So being able to provide web services is a big deal. And I'm going to talk primarily about REST web services. These are not web services that make you sleepy, but these are really web services that return either JSON or XML. The URL is important because it identifies the actual item you're working on, such as a certain book in a bookstore as a classic example, and uses HTTP parameters to kind of configure the request. All of it running across HTTP or HTTPS is important for sure. When we talk about specific web service standards, then we have to look at supporting these three things I list here, and there's actually more to it, but these are some of the main things that you have to support. So a specific URL pattern, maybe I want to have bookstore and then book or something like that. We'll see examples. Specific parameters, and we'll see examples of that. And then what you're sending and receiving a specific XML and JSON format. So you can't just throw any XML or JSON. There is a standard out there you're trying to meet. So how do we do this with FME? Well, calling FME Server to get XML and JSON, you do through the data streaming service. In the workspace, there's a new parameter for this release called URI parameter, which is the entire request string, including the server name, the entire URL, all the parameters. Then you have full control. You can work with that, tear it apart, and use it to determine what the proper course action is. You can look at the headers. And then, of course, we've got great JSON and XML transformers for working with that kind of data. The beauty of this approach, though, of using FME Server for this is all of the logic of the standard, the implementation is in the workspace. You get all the transformation capability of FME, 400 plus transformers, no coding. You create these services just by dragging and dropping pieces together. So much easier than writing code, in my opinion. We're going to now look at three examples of web services that have been implemented with FME Server. The first one is a classic one. There'll be a presentation later on that covers off this in much greater detail, so I'm going to be pretty brief here. Then this Geneo Augmented Reality, I'll cover that more. It's more of a RESTful one, and then a new one that I just created, subscription management. So starting with the OGC WXS, we can think of this as it's a classic service. It's less RESTful, but it's more like a CGI request where the parameters are passed. The request and the thing you want to work on is sent as an HTTP parameter or a URL argument. But all that gobbledygook aside, basically the client that's using WFS goes to FME Server and says, I want to get your capabilities. Now FME Server goes, oh, get capabilities for OGC, WXS? Okay, I'm going to send you an XML document. Then the client, maybe it's a viewer or whatever it is, says, now I want to get a certain feature, sends a layer, sends the features it wants. Then FME Server goes, oh, you want to get the feature? Okay, here's GML back. That's effectively how it works. All the brains are in the workspace. And as I said, there'll be more on that, a whole presentation on that later. The second example is, again, it's another web service, augmented reality web service. And what is augmented reality? It's really, Google Glass is probably the best example of a commercial example right now. But if we look here, what it is the ability to overlay more information onto the real world, if you will. Here we see the businesses in the city of Surrey, and so you can look around and see them, and with Google Glass it's going to become more and more important. You can overlay 3D information, all kinds of stuff. But how does it work? Well, you have a channel. Basically, this is the client, and the browser, the little web application, goes and looks at a channel. So you define a channel here, and what is a channel? It's a link to a web service endpoint, and in this case, again, it's the FME data streaming service. So here's the data streaming service URL right here, and you get this right off the web interface. I put that into the Geneo client there to configure the channel. And this is just a workspace that serves up, and we'll see it in a second here, serves up XML. Now, the key part here for Geneo is they're kind of restful in how they implemented their service, and they said, you need to support these URLs with your web service. And so points of interest, you might want to do a search, or points of interest, event, and so on and so forth. So we need to deal with that. They also say you need to deal with these certain parameters. So I want to ask for points of interest in a certain location, to a certain perimeter, and a maximum number of features. So you have to deal with that. Here is what a request from that mobile device, from that augmented reality browser will look like. It's the URL to our data streaming service, to our particular workspace. Then they add on the pattern, which identifies the resource and then the action. And then they have a number of parameters to configure that action. So we'll keep going. Here's the workspace. Briefly, it comes over here. We determine the action. We come through. We create a point out of what's being passed in, which is a lat and long, as a published parameter, which is a URL argument. We come along here. We use the buffer parameter that's sent on that URL. Again, here, there's the perimeter that's used here. We go and grab the points of interest out of the database, and then we sample to grab just the maximum amount of features that were requested, again, back in this parameter here, create XML, and we push it back out. And so just to kind of bring us back to what are we implementing here, well, the first thing to think about is the request URL, and that's all the way back here. Here's that whole request URL, including points of interest search. So in the test filter, we look at that parameter. Again, this is a new parameter that provides that whole string. Does it contain the points of interest search? If it does, then I want to go one way and deal with that. I haven't implemented the other 4 calls, but if this is the only one that's required for the browser, but if I wanted to, I would add another test to make sure I could then deal with those requests. Over here, I got published parameters, which are really the latitude, longitude, the perimeter, and again, the max features to return. Grab them into parameters and use them throughout the workspace. So that's how we deal with the URL and the URL arguments. And then, of course, the third thing we talk about is the actual payload. And they say, you must give us ARL XML. So it's like the OGC requires GML. They require this kind of format here. And so no problem. We've got this cool transform called the XML templater. Allows you to template up that XML. You just give it a sample. Say you want to insert things here and here, and we create that and push it off through the data streaming service to that service. So that's an example of implementing 2 existing services. One a little bit older, a newer one with some REST capabilities, REST flavor to it, if you will. But how about if we just want to create our own REST API? We say, I got an idea. I want to manage subscriptions of email addresses to FME Server topics, so that if somebody sends a message to a topic, only the email addresses that are subscribed will get that message. I could do that with a workspace. Let's do that with a REST API. So the nouns we have to deal with in here, we have the entities, we've got the topics, and then subscriptions, which are really an agreement between them. So those are the kind of things that we need to deal with. And let's make it RESTful by identifying the thing to work on, the email address and the topic. Let's do that right in the URL pattern. So what does that look like? That looks like this here. Here's the data streaming, the end part of the data streaming service URL, working on an entity, an ID, which would be an email address. And here we're saying add an entity, which is an email address. Then we can add a subscription, so we will add a subscription to a certain topic name with this ID, and so on and so forth throughout there. And because New Age, let's return JSON. I hope Don's not listening. Let's just return JSON, not XML, because JSON's made for the web. It's JavaScript, so we're going to do that. That's what the cool kids are doing, so we'll do that. And I'll just bring up this web page and show the calls, and I won't take too much more time on that demo, but I will bring that up here. So here we go, an actual call here. Again, we're adding an entity, which is this Gmail address. So I can hit add, and in this case, it already exists, so I'll blow that away. And then if I click this, this is showing what's returned. Again, we're returning JSON just to say, okay, the entity's added. If I click it again, it already exists. If I want to subscribe to it, here's the URL, add a subscription to this topic using this email address, add. And it'll send off a subscription. The subscribe and publish thing is not that important, but the important thing is that all of this is done through a URL, what you see here. And so I'm going to come back and just highlight a few final things, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. So yeah, again, we're looking at that FME Server request URI, that new publish parameter that's offered with 2014. And in there, we can get the URL, and part of that URL is the word entity, and part of it is subscription. So we'll filter out and basically say, if we're going to work on an entity, let's go and have some logic to implement that call. If we're going to work on a subscription, let's have some logic to implement that call. And so you can implement a whole REST API right within within a workspace. Very flexible way of doing that. And then, of course, you want to put out JSON. So just like XML, you can put out JSON using a nice template or transformer there. So what is the message of this? Really, the message is if you have implementing existing standards, or you want to create new web services, new web service standards, it's easy with FME. You do it in the workspace. There's no code to write. You just do that up in the workspace, and it's pretty straightforward. And you will see a more in-depth example of the OGC web feature service later on today. So that wraps that up.